can start.
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
This morning I'd like to discuss with you the development of catalyst systems for the control of sulfur dioxide emissions from FCC from fluid catalytic cracking units. I'd like to trace their historical development, or at least their chronological development, because I believe that the chronological development of the sulfur dioxide system at Amoco pretty well parallels what's been done by other workers in the field. We'll look at the composition variables, motors, and the activation of these SOx control catalysts. We'll also look at some of the catalytic systems that are now being pursued commercially to control SOx emissions from FCC units. The driving force in this research is the 1987 EPA regulations, which will limit SOx emissions to less than 300 parts per million. If you're curious about the background of this particular slide, these are two of Amoco's fluid catalytic cracking units. It's almost 10 years to the day since Vasalos and his co-workers at Amoco announced the development of the UltraCat system for handling SOx controls from fluid catalytic cracking units. They did this in a paper reported at the 1977 API meeting in Chicago. Shortly after that time, a number of companies made announcements that they too had developed catalysts for handling sulfur dioxide emissions. These are the dates of the announcements that we found in the trade literature. Amoco and others, of course, have been working in this area for well over 15 years. Shortly after the Amoco announcement, ARCO and virtually all of the fluid catalytic cracking manufacturers announced that they too had systems for handling the emission of controlling the emissions from fluid catalytic cracking units. The last announcement was made by Chevron in 1986. Collectively, well over 80 patents have been issued to Amoco, the other major oil refiners, and virtually all of catalyst manufacturers. This is an oversimplification of the chemistry that's involved in the process. In the regenerator, catalyst is added as, and here we've depicted it as metal oxide, could be cracking catalyst. Here it reacts with the sulfur dioxide and sulfur trioxide that is formed when sulfur in the coke is burned in an excess of oxygen to form the metal sulfate. The temperatures here can vary between 1250 degrees Fahrenheit and 1350 Fahrenheit, and the times vary between 10 and 20 minutes. The catalyst then moves from the regenerator to the reactor stripper section, where the catalyst then reacts with and is reduced by hydrogen and hydrocarbon during the cracking reaction. And in the presence of steam in the splitting operation, the sulfur is then converted to hydrogen sulfide. The catalyst is then regenerated and ready to go back for another cycle. During the cracking operation, the temperatures can vary between 925 degrees and 1,000 degrees F, and the times that the catalysts are in the reactor are less than 1 minute. I'd like to point out that under these conditions, particularly under the severe conditions in the regenerator, the cracking catalyst and the SOx transfer catalyst must be rugged to withstand those conditions. Also, any catalyst that's put into the system for SOx transfer control must not have an adverse reaction for any of the catalysts reactions that are taking place during the cracking reaction itself. This is a diagram showing our experimental equipment. We blend sulfur dioxide and oxygen, mix it with helium saturated with water at room temperature to give a composition of 1,000 parts per million sulfur dioxide, 2.7% oxygen, and about 2% water. The gas mixture is passed over the catalyst. About 1 gram of catalyst is used in the system. The reactor is quartz. It's provided with an axial thermal well. The gases then exit and are analyzed as they pass through a DuPont UV analyzer. We've used this piece of apparatus for all of our screening work, as well as for following the deactivation of SOx transfer catalyst during commercial trials. We'll report our data as the percent sulfur dioxide removed or as the amount of sulfur dioxide that's removed over some time frame. All of our catalysts are pre-treated in steam at temperatures between 1250 and 1550 Fahrenheit. Well, let's move on to cracking catalysts, where this all began. This is a plot of the percent of sulfur removed versus time for 3 different cracking catalysts of varying aluminum content, varying between 30, 40, and 60%. And you can see that the amount of sulfur dioxide removed depends upon the amount of alumina that's in the cracking catalyst. A higher alumina removes more sulfur dioxide than either the 40% or the 30%. This green line actually represents 2 catalysts. One catalyst that was made with rare earth exchange Y, and one that contained the rare earth in the hydrogen form. This is slightly misleading to us in the beginning because we thought, based on this data, that the rare earth had no influence on the sulfur dioxide absorption. To further quantify the alumina effect, we made up a series of catalysts in which we varied the alumina concentration from 0 to 100%, and we measured the sulfur dioxide removed at the end of a 92-minute period for each one of these catalysts. The catalysts which contain from about 25 to 50% shows a marked increase in the amount of sulfur dioxide absorbed, and this increases continuously until we reach high SOx absorption at 100% aluminum. This agrees well with the data that had been previously reported by workers at Chevron. So we conclude from this that alumina is a very important component in the catalyst. What about the rare earth, and what about the pore size of the alumina in the matrix? Those are 2 questions that we raised next. We made up these 3 series of catalysts containing exhaustively exchanged rare earth Y, or rare earth in the hydrogen form. 2 different types of alumina in the silica alumina matrix, small pore and large pore. Measured the sulfur dioxide removal capacity versus time, and found that small pore aluminas or large pore made little or no difference on the amount of sulfur dioxide that was absorbed. But the rare earth type made a large difference. The US Y was much less active than the REY for sulfur absorption. So based on the data of the previous slide where we showed that aluminum was important, we now see that the rare earth was important. And this contradicted the information we had on an earlier slide, which showed that the rare earth Y and the US Y were comparable. To try to explain this, we made up 2 catalysts in which we varied the rare earth types. One catalyst was made up with a well-exchanged rare earth Y. That is, it contained less than 0.2% sodium. The other one was made up with a moderately exchanged rare earth Y. That is, it contained up to 2% sodium. We then measured the sulfur dioxide removal capability for each of these catalysts versus time. You can see that the exhaustively exchanged rare earth Y was much more effective than the moderately exchanged Y for removing sulfur dioxide. So based on our work with alumina, the cracking catalyst, and with the rare earth, we can make the following conclusions on the work so far that we showed and that other workers in the field have shown. The cracking catalyst, alumina, is important for sulfur dioxide removal. Available alumina in the FCC catalyst does absorb the SOx, but a number of cracking catalysts do not contain sufficient quantities of alumina to meet the current emission standards. Rare earth oxides are important catalyst components. More so are tend to be more effective for absorbing SO2. And based on our limited data, catalysts made with aluminas of varying pore size had little or no effect on sulfur dioxide removal. So the alumina pore size in the matrix is not critical. Well, what happens when we add small amounts of alumina and rare earths to FCC catalyst? In this set of experiments, the FCC catalyst was a low alumina cracking catalyst that had very low sulfur dioxide activity. We assigned this a value of 0. We then took the FCC catalyst and added to it, by impregnation, 25 parts per million cerium. There was a marked increase in the amount of sulfur dioxide absorbed. When we further took the cracking catalyst and added 5% particulate alumina, we likewise saw a marked increase in the amount of sulfur dioxide absorbed. Further, when we took the cracking catalyst, impregnated with 25 parts per million cerium, and 5% particulate alumina, there was a dramatic increase in the amount of sulfur that was absorbed, more than we would have predicted from the additive effect of the cerium and the alumina. Likewise, when we impregnated 25 parts per million of cerium on alumina and added that as a 5% particulate matter to the cracking catalyst, we likewise saw a large increase in the amount of sulfur dioxide absorbed. Well, what about additives and promoters? Is cerium unique as a promoter? To test this out, we made up a series of catalysts containing 10% rare earth on alumina and tested these catalysts under comparable conditions. We used the cerium here as our base case and assigned it a relative activity of 1. You can see that yttrium was equivalent to cerium in its activity, and the rare earth mixed oxides rich in cerium likewise were high in their sulfur dioxide absorption activity. Lanthanum was slightly less active than cerium, and the rest of the rare earths were much less effective for removing sulfur dioxide. Well, what about other promoters? Platinum had been used and had been suggested as a promoter for sulfur dioxide removal, and so we made these 3 catalysts. 2 of them contained platinum at 2 concentrations, 2 parts per million and 100 parts per million. The other sample was pure alumina. We measured the SOx removal capacity versus time, and found that at 1200 degrees, both of the platinum samples were very efficient for removing sulfur dioxide. Alumina was much less active. At 1300 degrees, there's a slight deactivation for both of the platinum-containing samples. When alumina begins to look more active for sulfur dioxide removal. At 1400 degrees Fahrenheit, both of the platinum samples show some deactivation, and alumina begins to improve its activity for removing sulfur dioxide. In fact, had we run these set of experiments on up to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, we would have found that all of these catalysts were equivalent to removing sulfur dioxide. Well, platinum is effective for removing or for promoting alumina as a sulfur dioxide transfer catalyst. However, sulfur has problems. Platinum has problems. Platinum can promote the formation of NOx, and nothing excites a refinery manager more than to see an orange plume rising above his catalytic cracking unit. Further, although expense when it's used at low concentrations is not important for a platinum-containing catalyst, in order to control the SOx emissions to a given level, if more catalyst has to be used, then catalyst cost is one of the considerations that has to be taken into account. Therefore, we focused all of our attention on cerium as a promoter. What about catalyst deactivation? To test this, we made a large pilot plant run in which we had used 10% cerium on alumina as a catalyst mixed with the fluid cracking catalyst. The catalyst was deactivating, and we thought that catalyst deactivation may have been caused by attrition and by loss in surface area. we had developed a very simplified model relating surface area attrition loss and sulfate accumulation to SO2 removal activity. When we applied the model to our data, the predicted values were in very much disagreement with the observed values. We therefore concluded that we had to look somewhere else for the answer for catalyst deactivation rather than attrition and surface area loss. We took the samples at 30 and 60 hours and 80 hours and examined them by scanning electron microscopy. These are the SEM EDAX analysis of the samples that we used at the 30 and 60 hours from the previous slide. You can see the outline of the cerium monoaluminum catalyst here. The spots are silicon. The silicon has moved well into the interior of the cerium alumina SOx transfer catalyst, even more so at the end of 60 hours, and even to a greater extent at the end of 80 hours. Silicon then is one of the factors that's probably causing the deactivation of the catalyst. Perhaps not the only one, but one of the major factors. To further show this, we treated a catalyst in the, we looked at the sulfur dioxide removable capacity versus steaming time for a catalyst that was just calcined at 1,000 degrees and then steamed versus two catalysts that were interactively steamed. One with no cracking catalyst, this one up here, and two in which we had a high alumina cracking catalyst mixed in and a low alumina cracking catalyst mixed in with the cerium monoalumina SOx additive catalyst. We then separated the catalyst and measured the sulfur dioxide capacity and found out that while the catalyst that was steamed in the absence of cracking catalyst deactivated, the catalyst that was steamed in the presence of high and low alumina cracking catalyst deactivated to a much greater extent. In fact, the catalyst that was steamed in the presence of low alumina seemed to deactivate at a much greater extent than the catalyst that was steamed in the presence of high alumina. We then took the three samples at the end of 2 hours, the catalyst that was steamed by itself, and each of the catalysts that was steamed with high and low alumina, as well as the samples over here at 24 hours, and again we examined these by SEM EDAX. These are the samples from our analysis. The catalyst that was steamed by itself shows a very small amount of silicon in its exterior. This is picked up because we did the steaming in the Vicor reactor. However, the samples that were steamed interactively with a fluid cracking catalyst showed a high concentration of silica at the interior of the SOx transfer catalyst. This is the sample that was steamed in the presence of high alumina for 2 hours. This is the sample that was steamed in the presence of low alumina for 2 hours. You can see there's a marked difference in the concentration of silicon that has reached the interior of the SOx transfer catalyst. Likewise, at 24 hours, again, some silicon was picked up from the Vicor steaming reactor for the catalyst that was steamed by itself, whereas the two catalysts that were steamed for 24 hours interactively with low and high alumina show substantial amounts of silicon distributed throughout the SOx transfer catalyst. About the time we did this work, Vern and his co-workers at Engelhard reported their work on the deactivation of SOx transfer catalyst by silica, and our results here agree very well with theirs. Well, to further show the effect of steam and the necessity of having steam and the effect of high temperatures, we took a series of catalysts in which we did not treat the catalyst with steam. This catalyst was simply calcined. Two samples in which we increased the temperature from 1400 to 1500 degrees steaming operation, measured their sulfur dioxide removal versus the percent of silica which we added to each of these catalysts in the form of silicic acid. Again, we saw some deactivation by silica from the catalyst that contained no steam, although it was much more moderate than the catalyst that was steamed at either 1400 or 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. These data show that three effects are necessary for the deactivation. First of all, you have to have a source of silica, and secondly, temperature is required as well as presence of steam. And it's fairly well known that silicon is mobile in steam, especially at temperatures beyond 1250 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, the source of the silica is another question that came up. We believe that there are three sources that could lead to silica deactivation. One is the pure silica, which might be present in the cracking catalyst. Certainly silica that could be present from the silica alumina in the matrix. And finally, the silica that's present in the aluminum silicate molecular sieve that's used in the cracking catalyst. To show this effect, we took samples of pure silica gel, silica alumina, and aluminosilicate molecular sieve, steamed these with our alumina Syria additive, separated them, and again examined them by scanning electron microscopy and EDAX. And again, we found a sample that was steamed in the presence of pure silica. There was a substantial migration of silicon across and well distributed throughout the cerium on aluminum FOX transfer catalyst. The same was true with the silica alumina, silica available from the silica aluminum matrix, although the concentration was much less. With the molecular sieve, because the molecular sieve is more finely divided, the silicon accumulated as a dust outlining the particle rather than distributing itself across the cross-section of the SOX additive. And so we conclude that silica is coming from the silica aluminum matrix in the cracking catalyst. Well, how can we solve the deactivation problem? Since silica in the matrix, or silica in the form of free silica in the cracking catalyst, seems to be the source of silica, one of the obvious solutions is to prepare a catalyst that contains no silica in the matrix, an all-alumina, silica alumina cracking catalyst. This and other suggestions have been made in the patent literature. For example, some people have suggested that we could use sodium, manganese, or phosphorus as materials to slow down the deactivation by silica. Unfortunately, these materials limit the kinds of catalysts that can be used in the FCC part of the cracking operation, and in fact may be deleterious to the cracking reaction themselves. One other solution to the deactivation problem is to develop a higher capacity SOX transfer catalyst. Magnesia has been shown to be active and more active than alumina for SOX capture. In fact, in 1949, Hertwig and Healy at Amoco showed that silica alumina magnesia catalyst was much more efficient for removing sulfur than silica alumina. Unfortunately, silica mag catalyst did not regenerate very well and was not a viable catalyst for the cracking operation. Another way of solving the problem was to increase the capacity of the catalyst. The idea here being that as you increase the capacity, the amount of catalyst used would be less, even though the catalyst may be deactivating at the same rate. Let's now look at the effect of magnesia. This is a plot of the SOX removal capacity based on the percent approach to stoichiometric removal of sulfur dioxide for a series of catalysts in which we have varied the alumina and magnesia concentration. All of these catalysts contain 6% Syria, and all of these catalysts were steamed for 5 hours at 1400 degrees before we determined the SOX removal capacity. Approach to stoichiometry means that 100% approach to stoichiometry, and at that point, all of the magnesia, all of the alumina and Syria would have been converted to their sulfates. can see that magnesia is much more efficient than alumina for a SOx transfer. At 100% alumina, we're seeing about 4% approach to stoichiometry. And as we add increasingly more and more amounts of magnesia, once we reach about the 50% stoichiometric amount, we begin to see a dramatic increase in the SOx removal capacity. This increases until we get to 100% magnesia, and at this point we have well over 50% approach to stoichiometry. Well, we wanted to determine what the active ingredient of this system was, and so we took a series of catalysts that contained 50 mole percent of magnesia and alumina and 6% cerium, and looked at it a little bit further to see if we could tell what the active component was. Here we plotted the percent sulfur dioxide removed versus calcination temperature. We followed the sulfur dioxide removal shown here in red. We looked at the surface area of the catalyst here shown in yellow. And while we were treating these samples, we analyzed each one as we varied the temperature between 500 and 1300 degrees Celsius to try to determine what the active component was. At temperatures on up to about 750 to 800 degrees, the sulfur removal is very high and the surface area is high. In this area of high activity, the only constituent we could find by X-ray diffraction was high concentrations of gamma aluminum. At temperatures beyond 700 degrees, we begin to grow in the magnesium aluminate spinel. This continued on up with temperature until at 1300 degrees we were at 100% spinel formation. But we don't think the spinel is the active component because as the spinel concentration increases, the sulfur dioxide removal capacity decreases along with the surface area. In this area up here, the only component we could measure was the magnesium spinel. There was no other active component. Although we feel that in this area the active material is probably highly dispersed magnesium oxide. However, more work has to be done before we know that definitely. Well, let's now look at a series of commercially available catalysts. These catalyst systems are all based on either magnesium or alumina as the base, or combinations of magnesium and alumina, promoted with rare earths or platinum. This shows the sulfur removal capacity versus quantity of additive needed to remove high concentrations of sulfur dioxide. These catalysts were all tested fresh, no steaming, and you can see that those based on the magnesium system are very active, followed by the systems that are based on platinum. Platinum and cerium on alumina are about equivalent in their activity, and alumina itself is only marginally active, and you need a lot more alumina in order to reach the same activity level as the rest of these catalysts. Well, fresh catalyst activity is one property of the catalyst that's important. Regenerability is another property. In order to get a feel for the regenerability of these catalysts, we tested all these by adjusting their activities to the same point by determining how much material we needed to maintain the same initial activity. We looked at these by looking at the sulfur dioxide removal. After we had treated each one of the catalysts, first with sulfur dioxide and then with hydrogen to regenerate the catalyst at temperatures up to 930 degrees. We repeated these cycles 6 times for each one of these catalysts, sulfur dioxide followed by hydrogen. And this gives us some indication as to the regenerability of this catalyst system. You can see from the data that the platinum on alumina retained about and recovered about 60% of its initial activity after completing 6 cycles. Likewise, the cerium on alumina was very active and was regenerating to about 60% of its original activity. Whereas alumina, magnesium, and lanthanum-containing catalysts were all regenerated to a much lower level. 6 cycles is not very long in the lifetime of the cracking catalyst, but this gave us some idea on the regenerability of the catalyst. Well, fresh catalyst activity and regeneration are important, but we saw that deactivation was also a very important consideration for these catalysts. Part of these same series of catalysts deactivate in the presence of interactive steaming with the cracking catalyst. The next slide shows us the data of the following sets of catalysts: the alumina, lanthanum, cerium alumina, platinum alumina, magnesium. Again, we adjusted the initial activity for all these catalysts by taking different catalyst weights. And we treated each one of these catalysts by steaming interactively with a low alumina cracking catalyst for 5 hours at 1400 degrees, and then we measured the SOx removable capacity. Now this is a very severe test because it means because the alumina is much less active than the magnesium, we're using a lot more alumina than we have magnesium. Nonetheless, we can see from the deactivation study that alumina loses very little of its activity, whereas silica is very much affected by silicon deactivation. Now, which one of these catalysts will be used by the petroleum refiner will depend on a number of factors. First of all, it will depend on the type of cracking catalyst he has in his cracking zone. It will depend upon the temperature of the cracking zone, the temperature of the regenerator, and the type of reactor and sulfur that he has coming into the system. Well, this morning we have covered a number of compositional studies. We looked at catalyst promoters and deactivation. So what kind of conclusions can we come to, and what kind of conclusions have other workers come to in determining the ability of these materials to control the SOx emissions? First of all, we can conclude that SOx emissions can be controlled by transfer catalysts. We think we pretty well understand catalyst deactivation, at least deactivation by silica, although we don't quite understand the deactivation mechanisms in some of these more active systems. More work needs to be done to characterize the nature of the new additives, particularly those based on magnesium. And finally, the refiner has a wide choice of catalysts to use to meet his particular needs. And I'd like to finally close by acknowledging my co-workers, Gene Hirschberg, Frank Monica, and Judy Munn,